Imagine you haven't received a call, a text message, or even a birthday card for 20 years from the very children you gave birth to and raised. Then one day, a luxurious envelope appears at your door. Inside is an invitation to a family party. Your heart swells. You think, finally, they remembered me. But the truth behind that party is more cruel than 20 years of silence combined. This is the story of Margaret Ellis, and it will make you rethink the meaning of the word family. If you're watching this video, hit like now and comment your city or country below. I want to know how far this story has traveled the world. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next sensational stories. Now let's begin. The day the letter arrived, I was on my hands and knees in the backyard, pulling weeds out from between the stones of a garden path I'd been meaning to fix for 3 years. That was the kind of life I lived. Not broken enough to fall apart, not hopeful enough to make plans. Just maintenance, just getting through. My neighbor Dolores called over the fence, waving something white and cream-colored in the air. "Margaret, something came for you. Looks fancy." I stood up slowly. My knees weren't what they used to be, and wiped my hands on the back of my jeans. Dolores was already at the gate, her eyebrows raised the way they always were when she had something to say, and was pretending she didn't. "Hand addressed," she said, holding it out like evidence. Thick paper, the kind with a watermark. I took it. My name was written in a handwriting I hadn't seen in 20 years, but I recognized it immediately. The way the capital M curved, the way the L in Ellis tilted slightly to the right, like it was leaning on something for support. Chloe. My daughter had written my name on an envelope. I didn't open it right away. I don't know why. Maybe I was afraid of what was inside. Or maybe I was afraid of what wasn't. I carried it into the kitchen, set it on the counter next to a half-empty coffee mug, and stood there looking at it for a long time. 20 years. I need you to understand what that number actually means. It's not an abstraction. It's not a clean, cinematic kind of estrangement where everyone cries beautifully and reconciles at the end. 20 years is 7,300 mornings of waking up and remembering that your children chose to leave and never turn back. It's 730 missed birthdays between the two of them. It's holidays you stopped celebrating because the silence at the table was louder than anything else. It's the slow, grinding work of learning to take up space in a world that used to feel organized around being someone's mother and now doesn't seem to remember you exist. I had 2 children. A daughter, Chloe. A son, Ryan. I raised them in a yellow house outside of Greensboro, North Carolina, in a neighborhood where everyone left their porch lights on at night, and the schools were decent, and you could still afford a backyard on a teacher's salary. I taught 5th grade for 26 years. I packed school lunches and drove to soccer practice and stayed up until 2 in the morning helping with science projects I didn't fully understand. I was, by any reasonable measure, a present and devoted mother. I was also, I'll admit, not always an easy one. I had opinions, strong ones. I wasn't shy about them. When Chloe announced she was dropping out of her junior year of college to follow a man named Victor Hale across the country to Portland, I told her exactly what I thought. When Ryan quit his engineering program 6 months before graduation to start a business he couldn't explain to me in plain English, I told him exactly what I thought about that too. In hindsight, maybe I should have said less. Maybe I said too much. Maybe I should have known that some battles aren't worth the cost of the person you're fighting with. But I was their mother. I thought that meant I was allowed to worry. What I didn't understand then, what I understand now with painful clarity, is that Chloe and Ryan hadn't merely disagreed with me. They had decided somewhere along the line that I was more trouble than I was worth. And they had simply removed me. Like a subscription you forget to cancel and then one day just delete. The first year, I called. Every week, then every month, then on birthdays, on Thanksgiving, on Christmas morning. Sometimes the phone rang and rang. Sometimes it went straight to voicemail. Once Ryan picked up and said he was busy and would call me back, and he never did. Once, Chloe answered and spoke to me for 11 minutes. I know because I timed it. In a voice so carefully neutral, it was like speaking to a customer service representative who had been trained never to express anything real. After that, I stopped calling. You can only reach for something so many times before the reaching itself becomes its own kind of humiliation. I spent the next 18 years building the only kind of life I could build. I retired from teaching. I sold the yellow house and bought something smaller, a 2-bedroom on the edge of town with a garden I could manage, and a porch where I drank my coffee in the mornings and watched the light change. I made friends, cautiously, with women at the library book club and my neighbor Dolores, who was loud and unfiltered and made me laugh even when I didn't particularly want to. I was not miserable. I want to be honest about that. I had made a kind of peace, but there was always a room inside me that I kept locked, the room where I was still their mother, the room where I still hoped, and that room was the reason I couldn't throw that envelope away. I opened it that night after dinner with a glass of water on the table beside me because I'd given up wine the year before, something about not wanting to be the kind of woman who drinks alone to feel things. The card inside was heavy, embossed at the top with gold lettering. The Hale family cordially invites you. It was an invitation to a celebration, a milestone anniversary party for Chloe and Victor, to be held in 3 weeks at Whitmore Country Club, a place I had driven past but never entered, the kind of place with a long driveway lined with trees and a valet stand, and people who all seemed to know each other from somewhere you weren't invited. Handwritten at the bottom of the card, in that same tilted script, "Mom, we hope you'll come. It would mean so much. Chloe." I read those 2 sentences 11 times. I know because I counted. We hope you'll come. It would mean so much. She hadn't called. She hadn't written a letter explaining anything. Not a word about the years, not a single acknowledgement of what 20 years of silence does to a person. Just this, a printed invitation to a party with 8 words added at the bottom in ink. And yet I cried. I sat at that kitchen table and I cried in the way you cry when something you stopped letting yourself want suddenly appears in front of you again and you realize you never actually stopped wanting it at all. I called Dolores the next morning. She came over in her bathrobe with a box of crackers and listened while I read her the card 3 times. "Are you going?" she asked. "I don't know." "Yes, you do." She pointed a cracker at me. "You already know you're going. You're just looking for someone to tell you it's okay." She wasn't wrong. She usually wasn't. "What if it's not what I think it is?" I said. "What do you think it is?" I didn't answer right away. Outside, the morning was gray and quiet. A bird landed on the garden fence and looked at us through the window with complete indifference. "I think it might be an apology," I finally said. "A way of saying they're sorry. A first step towards something." Dolores chewed her cracker. She didn't say anything, which was unusual for her. That silence told me more than any words would have. Or, I added, it might be something else entirely. "Then you go and you find out," she said. "But you go knowing that. You go with your eyes open, not your chest wide open. There's a difference." I nodded. I tried to hold on to that difference. The next 3 weeks were strange. I found myself doing things I hadn't done in years, cleaning the closet, looking for an outfit. I owned almost nothing formal. I'd spent the last decade in cardigans and garden shoes and the occasional blazer for events at the library. I didn't want to spend money on something new, so I went through everything I had until I found it. A navy blue dress, the kind with a subtle sheen to it, fitted but not tight, with small pearl buttons at the collar. I'd bought it for my retirement dinner and worn it exactly once. I hung it on the back of the door and looked at it every morning. I told myself I wasn't dressing up for them. I was dressing up for myself. I told myself that every day until I almost believed it. The night before the party, I sat on the edge of my bed and held the dress in my lap and thought about every conversation I'd imagined having with my children over the past 20 years. All the things I would say, all the things I would ask. The question I'd asked myself 1,000 times and never found an answer to. What did I do wrong? And if I did something wrong, why didn't anyone tell me clearly enough that I could have fixed it? I thought about the version of me that had driven them to school and made their Halloween costumes by hand and cried at their high school graduations with a pride so fierce it almost hurt. I thought about how much of myself I had poured into those 2 people. I thought about how quiet my house had been for 20 years. Then I got up, ironed the dress, and laid it out for the morning. Whatever the reason they'd reached out, I was going. Because even after everything, Even after 20 years of silence and 1,000 ignored calls, and the long, slow work of learning to live without them, I was still their mother, and I still hoped. That hope was either the truest thing about me or the most dangerous. I wouldn't know which until I walked through those country club doors and looked my daughter in the eye. But I'd spent 20 years waiting. 3 more weeks was nothing. The drive to Whitmore Country Club took 40 minutes, and I spent most of it rehearsing things I would never actually say. I had a whole conversation planned in my head, the kind where I walked in calm and dignified, where Chloe saw me and her face broke open with something genuine, where we stood together in a corner somewhere quiet, and she said the words I'd been waiting 20 years to hear. "I'm sorry, Mom. I should have called. I should have tried harder. I missed you." In my rehearsed version, I didn't cry. I just nodded, and something heavy lifted off my chest, and we ate dinner together like people who belonged to each other. That was the version I'd been constructing all week, brick by brick, in the quiet hours before sleep. By the time I turned onto the long tree-lined driveway of Whitmore, I had almost convinced myself it was possible. The club was exactly what I expected, and somehow still managed to intimidate me. It sat back from the road on a rise of manicured land, a building that looked like someone had taken a colonial mansion and told it to dress up for dinner. White columns, arched windows, a circular drive with a fountain that probably ran year-round even in January. Valets in black vests were parking cars with the practiced efficiency of people paid to be invisible. I watched a couple step out of a silver Mercedes and walk inside without so much as glancing at the building around them, the way people move through spaces they've always belonged to. I drove myself. A 10-year-old Subaru with a cracked dashboard and a passenger seat permanently occupied by a canvas tote bag full of library books. I handed my keys to the valet, a young man who took them without expression, professional enough not to blink, and stood for a moment at the bottom of the front steps, smoothing the front of my navy dress. Eyes open, I reminded myself, not chest wide open. There's a difference. I held on to Dolores's words like a handhold on a steep slope, and I walked inside. The interior was all warm light and polished floors, and the low-layered murmur of a room full of people who all seemed to know what to do with their hands. Long tables had been arranged in a horseshoe around a central dance floor that nobody was using yet. The centerpieces were extravagant, tall glass vases filled with white flowers I didn't know the name of, with candles burning at the base. Someone had strung soft gold lights along the ceiling in a way that made everything look like it was lit from inside a memory. It was beautiful. I'll give them that. Whatever else I say about that night, the room itself was beautiful. I stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was probably comfortable, scanning the crowd, looking for a face I recognized. And then I found one. Chloe. She was across the room, laughing at something the woman beside her had said. Her head thrown back slightly, one hand on her collarbone in a gesture I recognized from when she was 17 and thought it made her look older. She was wearing a deep green dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and her hair was done in a way I didn't recognize, swept up and pinned. Very polished, very controlled. She looked older, obviously. We both did. But she looked expensive in a way I hadn't anticipated, like she had been produced rather than grown. She noticed me before I could start walking toward her. Something shifted in her expression, not quite a flinch, but close. Then she arranged her face into a smile, said something brief to the woman beside her, and crossed the room toward me. "Mom." She said it the way you say the name of a street you haven't been to in a long time. Familiar and slightly uncertain. She leaned in and hugged me, and it was the hug of someone who had practiced being polite. Arms that touched but didn't hold. A cheek that pressed briefly against mine without warmth. I held on a second too long. I knew it even as I was doing it. "You look wonderful," I said, because it was true and because I needed to say something. "You look good too." She stepped back and looked at me the way you look at something when you're trying to decide if it belongs where it is. "I'm so glad you could make it. Come in, come in." She gestured vaguely at the room, already looking past me, already scanning for something else. "There's a bar near the back wall, and dinner should start around 7. Let me get you settled." Settled. That word landed in a strange way, like I was cargo. She walked me to a table near the side of the room. Not at the front with the family, not near the center where things were happening, but at a round table set slightly apart, positioned near a potted plant that was taller than I was. There were two other couples already seated there. I didn't know any of them. "I'll be back to check on you," Chloe said, and then she was gone, slipping back into the crowd like water through fingers. I sat down. I unfolded my napkin. I smiled at the couple across from me, a man in his 60s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and a woman in a pale yellow blazer who introduced herself as Diane. "Are you family?" Diane asked pleasantly. "Yes," I said. "I'm Chloe's mother." Something passed across Diane's face that I couldn't quite read. "Oh," she said. "How nice." That "oh" stayed with me. I found Ryan about 20 minutes later, not because he came to find me, but because I went looking. I had spotted him near the bar, talking to a group of men in suits, all of them with the particular ease of people whose biggest logistical concern of the evening was which wine to order. He was heavier than I remembered, with a beard that was going gray at the chin, and he was wearing a jacket that fit him very well. He looked like a man who had made money and wanted you to know it without him having to say so directly. He saw me coming. I watched the recognition register, and then I watched him make a decision. The kind that happens fast, in half a second, the kind you can't pretend you didn't see. He said something brief to the men around him, and then he walked toward me, interposing himself in the path I was taking, as though positioning himself to manage a situation before it developed. "Mom." He kissed my cheek, efficient. The hug that followed was slightly longer than Chloe's, but no warmer. "You came. You sound surprised." "Not surprised, just glad." He said it with the smile of a man delivering a prepared remark. "You look healthy." "Healthy?" I repeated it gently. "Thank you." "Can I get you a drink?" "I'm fine. I just wanted to say hello." "Of course." He nodded. Behind him, one of the men in suits glanced over with mild curiosity. Ryan shifted slightly, angling his body in a way that quietly placed himself between me and that group. It was subtle. He probably didn't even realize he'd done it. But I noticed. "Your children are here?" I asked. "My grandchildren?" "Yeah, Eli and Sophie are here somewhere." He glanced around briefly. "They're probably in the back. I'll have them come say hi." They never came. I waited for them at that side table through 2 rounds of past appetizers. Little things on tiny plates that I didn't eat because I was too distracted to remember how eating worked, and they never appeared. I later spotted what I assumed were my grandchildren, a boy around 12 with Ryan's same heavy-lidded eyes, and a girl maybe 9 or 10 with a bow in her hair, both of them orbiting the dessert table at the far end of the room, completely absorbed in their own small world. I caught the girl's eye once, across the room. She looked at me with the polite blankness of someone looking at a stranger, then turned back to her brother. She didn't know who I was. Why would she? What had anyone told her? I sat with that for a long moment. The noise of the room pressed against me from all sides. Conversations overlapping, silverware touching plates, a woman's laugh rising sharp above everything else before dissolving back into the general hum. I sat in the middle of all of it and felt like a ghost. Present in the room, but not in it. Visible to no one. Victor Hale. I recognized from photographs Chloe had sent exactly 3 in the first years of their marriage, before the silence became total. He was tall, with the kind of confident posture that comes from never having seriously doubted himself, and he moved through the room the way politicians do, stopping at each cluster of people with a handshake and a sustained eye contact, and a word or two that made the recipient feel singled out. He had the ease of someone who had hosted 1,000 events and understood that the goal was to make people feel included while actually managing them. He came to my table about 45 minutes in. I watched him approach and steeled myself for whatever version of warmth he'd prepared. "Margaret." He extended his hand, and his shake was firm and brief and completely without intimacy. "I'm so glad you made it. Chloe was hoping you'd come." "She invited me," I said. "So here I am." He smiled at that, a controlled smile, the upper half of his face not participating. "You look wonderful. Can I get someone to bring you anything?" I'm fine. It's a beautiful evening. Congratulations on your anniversary. Thank you. He tilted his head as though receiving a compliment he'd been expecting. It's been a remarkable journey. Family is everything, isn't it? I looked at him for a moment before answering. I've always thought so, I said. Something in my tone must have registered because his smile held just a beat too long before he moved on. I'll make sure to find you before dinner, he said, and then he was already half turned away, already moving toward the next person, the next handshake, the next controlled moment of warmth dispensed with precision. Family is everything, he'd said. I looked around the room at the table where I was sitting, the table set apart from the family, the grandchildren who didn't know my name, the daughter who had walked away in 45 seconds, the son who had positioned himself between me and his associates like I was something to be managed. Family is everything, Victor Hale had said. Then why had I been given a table by a potted plant? The dinner itself was served in courses, which meant I had a great deal of time to sit with my thoughts between plates. The couple across from me, Diane and her husband, whose name I kept forgetting, were pleasant enough and asked polite questions about where I lived and what I did with my time, the kind of conversation you have with someone you'll never see again, and both parties are aware of it. I answered carefully, eating a little, trying not to watch Chloe's table too obviously. From where I sat, I could see the family table clearly. Chloe and Victor at the center, relaxed and laughing. Ryan beside them with his wife, a woman I'd never met named Greta, who had the careful grooming of someone who'd spent considerable effort on appearing effortless. The children ran back to that table occasionally, were absorbed briefly, then released again. There were toasts. There was laughter. There were moments where people leaned close to each other and spoke in the shorthand of people who shared a history that didn't include me. At some point during the third course, I excused myself and went to find the restroom. It was down a long hallway tiled in pale marble, and on the way back I stopped in front of a large mirror and looked at myself for a moment. The navy dress, the pearl buttons, the face of a 63-year-old woman who had driven 40 minutes to sit at a side table at a party she wasn't quite invited to, but not quite excluded from either, which was somehow the loneliest position of all. I thought about leaving. I genuinely considered it, going back to that table, getting my coat, handing the valet ticket to the young man in the black vest, and driving home in the dark. I thought about how I'd stop at the gas station on Route 12 and get one of those terrible cups of coffee from the machine, and how I'd drink it on the drive home and be sad about it, but also relieved, in the way you're relieved when a thing you were dreading turns out to be just sad instead of devastating. But I didn't leave. I went back to my table. I finished my dinner. I watched the room. And I waited. It was close to 9 o'clock when things shifted. Victor stood up from the family table, and the room quieted in the practiced way of a crowd that has been managed toward attentiveness. He thanked everyone for coming, said a few things about gratitude and legacy and the importance of building something that lasts, and then he said something that made the hair on my arm stand up. Tonight, he said, we're celebrating not just 25 years of marriage, but the beginning of the next chapter for our family, something we've been planning for a long time. And I'd love for everyone to hear about it, because this isn't just about Chloe and me, this is about all of us. He paused. Let the room breathe. Ryan, do you want to tell everyone? Ryan stood. He had a folder in his hand that I hadn't noticed before. He straightened his jacket, and when he looked up, his eyes found mine across the room for just a moment before moving on to the rest of the crowd. That moment of eye contact lasted less than a second. But it told me something. It told me that whatever was about to happen, he already knew I was here, and he had already decided what my role in it was going to be. We've been working for the last 2 years, Ryan began, with the voice of someone who has rehearsed, on an acquisition. A property on the Carolina coast, 12 acres, direct beach access, space for a main house, and 3 family cottages. The plan is to develop it as a family retreat, something that belongs to all of us, something we can pass down. He talked for several minutes. I heard the words without fully processing them at first. Words like generational asset and family legacy and long-term investment. The vocabulary of someone who had been in rooms full of people who talked like this and had absorbed the language. He showed something on a screen that had been set up near the bar. Renderings of a property that looked like a catalog photo, all clean lines and ocean views and the kind of blue sky that only exists in real estate brochures. People murmured appreciatively. Diane leaned toward her husband and said something I couldn't hear, and then Ryan said it. "We're almost there. The financing is in place for most of the purchase. But to close the deal, to actually make this happen for our family, we need one more piece." He looked directly at me then, not glancing, not accidentally, directly, with intention. "We're hoping Mom will help us with the final contribution." The room shifted. Not dramatically. Nobody gasped. Nobody turned to stare. But I felt it, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. A few people looked toward my table. Diane looked at me. Even the man with the reading glasses on his forehead looked at me. And I understood, with a clarity that landed like cold water, exactly why I had been invited. Not because Chloe had written 8 words at the bottom of a card and meant them. Not because 20 years of silence had finally become too heavy to carry. Not because my children had missed me or wanted me or needed me in the way that a child needs a mother. They needed my money. They had set a table for me by a potted plant, fed me a 3-course dinner I couldn't taste, and let me sit alone in a room full of people for 4 hours. And now, at 9 o'clock on a Saturday night, in front of everyone they had invited to witness it, they had called my name. Not to bring me back, to ask me to pay my way in. Chloe was looking at me from across the room. She had arranged her expression into something careful and hopeful, the look she used to give me as a child when she wanted something and had already calculated the odds of being told no. Ryan was still standing. Victor was watching. The whole room was waiting. I sat very still. I looked down at my plate. The remnants of a dessert I'd barely touched, something chocolate with a raspberry coulis, arranged in a deliberate arc across the white porcelain. Then I looked up. And I thought, "You rehearsed a conversation for 3 weeks, Margaret. You practiced what you'd say if they apologized. You never once practiced what you'd say if they did this." Somewhere in the room, a candle guttered in a draft from the ventilation system, and the warm light flickered for just a moment. Nobody moved. I set my napkin down very carefully beside my plate. I had come here hoping to be chosen. I had put on the navy dress and driven 40 minutes and sat at a side table for 4 hours on the fragile, stubborn hope that my children had finally decided I was worth choosing. What I hadn't considered, what I should have considered, was the possibility that to them, I had never been a person to be chosen. I had been a resource to be managed, and now that resource had been formally requested in front of witnesses at a dinner party because they had calculated, correctly probably, based on 20 years of reading my patterns, that I would have a harder time saying no in public than I would in private. They knew me. That was the worst part. They still knew me well enough to weaponize the way I worked. My hands were very steady in my lap. That surprised me. Victor was speaking again, softer now, something about the vision for the property, the room for the whole family, the legacy they were trying to build together, how Margaret would have her own cottage, her own space, her own piece of this. I heard all of it from a slight distance, the way you hear things when part of your mind has already stepped outside. I had driven 40 minutes in the hope of being someone's mother again. Instead, I had become a line item in someone's real estate deal. The candles burned, the gold lights hummed above me. The room waited, and I sat in the middle of all of it, holding the wreckage of something I had spent 20 years still quietly hoping for, turning it over in my hands like a thing I could no longer pretend was intact. Whatever I decided in the next few moments, nothing was ever going to be the same. I knew that. In my bones, in the part of me that had always known things before my mind caught up with them, I knew it. The question was what I was going to do with that knowledge. The thing about a moment that changes everything is that it doesn't announce itself. There's no music swell, no dramatic lighting shift, no pause long enough to let you prepare. 1 second you're sitting at a side table in a navy dress with a half-eaten chocolate dessert in front of you, and the next second you understand with the kind of clarity that only arrives after a very long time of not wanting to see something clearly, exactly what you are to the people who are supposed to love you most. Victor was still talking. His voice had taken on the quality of a presentation, measured, enthusiastic in controlled bursts, the practiced cadence of a man who was accustomed to rooms full of people and knew how to fill them. He was describing the property now in more detail, the acreage, the water access, the potential for appreciation over the next decade, The vision of a family compound that could be passed to the next generation. He said the word legacy 4 times in 3 minutes. I counted, because counting gave my mind something to do while the rest of me tried to catch up with what was happening. Ryan had sat back down. He was looking at me still, occasionally, with the expression of someone monitoring a situation. Chloe had her eyes on Victor, but her posture was wrong. Too upright, too careful, the posture of a person who is performing composure rather than actually feeling it. And then Victor stopped talking about the property. He looked at me. "Margaret," he said, and the way he said my name, warm, inclusive, pulling me into the room with a single word, was the most accomplished thing I'd seen him do all evening. "We've talked about this as a family, and we feel strongly that this investment is for all of us, for the whole family. That includes you." The room was quiet in the particular way of a crowd that has been collectively asked to witness something and has collectively decided to pretend it isn't witnessing it. Conversations at nearby tables had dimmed. People were paying attention while arranging themselves to appear as though they weren't. "There would be a cottage for you," Victor continued, "fully yours, your name on it, a place you can go whenever you want, no need to ask, no scheduling around anyone. The beach is beautiful, Margaret. You'd love it." He smiled. It was a good smile. If I hadn't spent 4 hours watching him deploy it at precisely calculated intervals across the room, I might have found it convincing. "How much?" I said. The words came out quieter than I intended, but steadier. Victor's smile didn't waver. He had anticipated this. He had anticipated everything. "The final contribution we need is $240,000, he said, which, set against the total value of the property, represents roughly a 15% stake. Very favorable terms when you consider $240,000, I repeated. Not a question, just the number, said out loud in the air between us, because I needed to hear it exist in the physical world rather than just inside my own head where it had just detonated. $240,000 was almost everything I had. I had been a 5th grade teacher for 26 years. I had a pension, modest by any standard. I had the savings I'd accumulated slowly over 3 decades of careful living, of never taking vacations I couldn't afford, and driving cars until they had over 100,000 miles on them, and clipping grocery coupons and choosing the store brand without embarrassment. I had built that cushion the way you build anything without much raw material, slowly, patiently, with a lot of small decisions that individually meant nothing but collectively meant security. It meant I could pay for my own medical care if I needed it. It meant I could live in my house without panicking every time the roof needed work. It meant that at 63 years old, I was not dependent on anyone. That money was not an investment vehicle. That money was my independence. And my children knew exactly how much of it I had. I don't know how they knew. I had never discussed my finances with them. How could I, when we hadn't spoken in 20 years? But I suspected Victor, with his business connections and his comfort in the rooms where financial information moved between people, had found ways to build a picture. Or perhaps Chloe remembered more from our last years together than I'd given her credit for. Or perhaps they had simply estimated, based on what they knew about what a retired teacher with no debt and no dependents and 3 decades of careful saving might have accumulated, and landed close enough to the truth to be dangerous. Ryan leaned forward in his chair. "Mom." His voice had shifted. Less boardroom now, more something personal. Whether the personal quality was genuine or another layer of the performance, I genuinely couldn't tell. "This isn't just a financial thing. That's not how we're thinking about it. This is about bringing the family back together, having a place where everyone is in the same space, where the kids can know their grandmother. Eli and Sophie, they should know you. We want that." I looked at my son, at the face I had watched grow from infancy to adulthood, that I had memorized the way you memorize the face of someone you love, which is to say, without intending to, simply through the accumulated weight of looking. He was 41 years old, and there were lines around his eyes I didn't recognize, and gray in his beard I hadn't known was there, and I felt the particular grief of realizing how much time had accumulated in a person's face while you weren't watching. "You want Eli and Sophie to know their grandmother?" I said slowly. "Yes." They've had a grandmother for their entire lives, Ryan. Where was this concern 5 years ago? 10? When Sophie was born and I found out from a mutual acquaintance 6 months later? The table went quiet. Diane and her husband had stopped pretending not to listen. Ryan's jaw tightened slightly. "That's not fair," he said. "What isn't fair about it?" "Things were complicated. You know things were complicated between us." "Things were complicated," I said. "Yes. And in 20 years of complications, not one of you could find 30 minutes for a phone call. But now there's a beach property involved, and suddenly you want me at the table. You want the family together." I paused. "Does the family togetherness come with the $240,000, or is it available separately?" Ryan's eyes went hard. Across the table, Chloe drew a sharp breath. "Mom," she said. Her voice had dropped. The careful warmth was gone, and what replaced it was something raw, something that might have been closer to her actual self. "That's not what this is." "Then tell me what it is, Chloe. Because from where I'm sitting, I was invisible for 20 years, and I became visible the moment you needed my savings account." "You're being unfair." Her voice had a tremor in it now that I couldn't fully read. Whether it was guilt or frustration or something else, I didn't know. "We invited you back because we wanted you here. The property is a separate conversation. You announced it at dinner, in front of all these people, with documents." I looked at the folder that Ryan had set on the table beside his plate, a plain manila folder that had been sitting there through the entire meal, patient and waiting. "How long has that folder been there, Ryan?" He didn't answer. "Did you bring it with you when you came in? Did you have it in the car? Did you plan this as the end of the evening, or was the whole evening designed to lead to this point? You're making this into something it isn't." His voice had gone flat and controlled, the voice of someone managing their own rising anger. "I'm asking questions," I said. "That's not the same thing." Victor stepped in with the smooth efficiency of a man who had handled difficult conversations professionally for decades. He set his palms flat on the table in a gesture I recognized as deliberately non-threatening, the body language of de-escalation. "Margaret, I hear you. I understand why this feels like a lot. We should have approached this differently. I'll take responsibility for the way tonight was structured, but the core intention is genuine. We want you in this family's life. We want you part of what we're building. The contribution is real, yes, but so is the return. Legal ownership, a real stake. This is not charity, and it's not a gift. It's an investment with your name on the deed." He slid the folder across the table toward me. I looked at it but didn't touch it. "My name on the deed," I said. "Absolutely. As a 15% stakeholder. That's correct? And the other 85% belongs to you and Chloe. And Ryan and Greta. Yes, family ownership, distributed across. So if the four of you decided to sell," I said, "you could outvote me." A small pause. Almost imperceptible, but I was watching. "That's not the intention. That's not what I asked, Victor. I asked if the ownership structure would allow you to outvote me on a sale." Another pause. Longer this time. "Technically, a majority vote would—" "Yes," I said. "It would." I looked at the folder on the table in front of me. Then I looked up at Victor, at Chloe, at Ryan. At the three of them arranged across the table from me like a panel, which I suppose was what they were. And I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because it matters, because it was not what I expected. I expected anger. I had been angry before in my life, really angry, the kind that makes your hand shake and your voice go thin, and I had been bracing for it, had felt something building in my chest through the whole of Victor's speech that I thought was anger taking shape. But what arrived instead was something quieter, and in its own way, much more devastating. It was grief. Pure, uncomplicated grief for the thing I had spent 20 years hoping for and had now conclusively, finally, inarguably confirmed was not available. Not in any version, not at any price. My children did not miss me. They had not invited me back because they were sorry, or because something in their lives had shifted and they had felt the absence of their mother and decided to do something about it. They had not lain awake at night thinking about what they'd done. They had looked at their balance sheet and found a gap and they had filled it with me. That was it. That was the whole of it. I had been a line item in someone's financial plan, and the dinner and the gold lights and the 8 words written at the bottom of an embossed invitation card were the packaging around the ask. They were the bow on the box. The grief of that was enormous. I won't minimize it, but underneath the grief, and this surprised me, this is the part I could not have predicted, there was something else, small and new and fragile, but there. A kind of clarity I hadn't felt in a long time, maybe ever. Because here's the thing about hope. It's not a comfort. It's a weight. For 20 years I had carried the hope that my children would come back, and that weight had shaped everything. Every decision about how I spent my time, every quiet calculation about whether I was too much or not enough, or too opinionated or too available or too withdrawn. Hope had made me manageable. Hope had kept me waiting in place. And now the hope was gone. And in its place was something that felt, underneath the grief, terrifyingly like freedom. I reached out and pulled the folder toward me. Across the table, Chloe exhaled. Ryan's shoulders released a fraction. Victor held very still. I opened the folder. The documents inside were what you'd expect: a purchase agreement, a partnership structure, signature pages marked with small yellow arrows pointing to the lines where I would write my name. It was professionally prepared. Someone had spent money on this paperwork, which told me the timeline and the seriousness of the plan. I turned the pages slowly, reading without reading, my eyes moving across the text without absorbing the specifics, because I wasn't actually evaluating the deal. I was buying time. I was letting them think I was considering it. And while I sat there with those pages in my hands, I became aware of something I had missed in the urgency of the confrontation. Ryan's wife, Greta, had not said a single word since I'd pushed back. She was sitting 2 seats down from Ryan, very straight, very still, with a wine glass she hadn't touched in the last 20 minutes. She was watching me with an expression I couldn't immediately categorize. Not hostile, not warm, something that lived in between. When she saw me notice her, she didn't look away. There was something in her eyes that I couldn't name yet, but that I filed away because it felt important. I closed the folder. I need to think about this, I said. Something in the air around the table released slightly, the pressure easing. Of course, Victor said immediately. Absolutely, take all the time you need. How much time do we have? Ryan asked, and then caught himself. I mean, but the timeline on the purchase is… Ryan, Chloe said his name quietly, with a small warning in it. The purchase needs to close within the next 3 weeks, Victor said, smoothly recovering. So ideally, we'd want to… 3 weeks, I said. There's some flexibility, Victor said, which told me there wasn't. I understand the timeline, I said. I set the folder back down on the table and pushed it a few inches toward them, not all the way back, just enough to establish that it was not mine. Not yet. I said I need to think. I meant it. I picked up my water glass and drank from it, and I was proud of the fact that my hand did not shake. The conversation did not end cleanly after that. Victor tried to steer things back to warmth, pulled in some of the other guests, laughed too loudly at something someone near the bar said, refreshed his wife's wine. Ryan spoke quietly to Greta, who listened without responding visibly. Chloe came to sit beside me for approximately 12 minutes, in which she talked about the property with the exhausting persistence of someone who has rehearsed a close, about the cottage that would be mine, about the winters she imagined us spending there together, about the grandchildren playing on the beach. She did not in those 12 minutes say anything about the 20 years. She did not mention the unreturned calls. She did not mention Sophie's birth announcement I'd received from a neighbor who had seen it on social media. She did not mention the Christmas I'd driven the 40 minutes to her house and sat in the car at the end of the driveway for 20 minutes before driving home because I couldn't bring myself to knock on a door that might not open, or that might open and be worse. She talked about the beach house. She talked about the future as though the past did not exist and did not matter, and certainly did not require acknowledgement. And I sat beside her and listened and nodded in the appropriate places and felt the grief do its work on me, quietly and thoroughly, like water wearing down stone. It was close to 10:30 when I finally stood up and said I needed to go. Chloe walked me to the door. Ryan intercepted us near the coat check and stood beside his sister in a way that felt coordinated, both of them facing me in the marble foyer with the sounds of the party still audible behind them. "We really do hope you'll consider it seriously, Mom," Ryan said. "This is a real opportunity, and we do want you involved." "I know you do," I said. "We've missed you," Chloe said, and her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and I looked at her face and tried to find the lie in it, tried to find the calculation, because I wanted it to be simple. I wanted it to be clean. I wanted her to be simply a villain so I could simply walk away. But her eyes were wet, actually wet, and I didn't know what to do with that. I still don't, if I'm being honest. I don't know if she was grieving the same thing I was grieving, a relationship that had been destroyed so gradually and thoroughly that neither of us could point to the exact moment it went, or if she was grieving the money she thought she was about to lose. I don't know if both things were true at once. I don't know if she herself knew. People are complicated, even the ones who hurt you, maybe especially them. "I'll be in touch," I said. I hugged her. It was slightly warmer than the hug she'd given me when I arrived. She held on a little longer. I noticed that. I held it in my hands the way I'd held everything about the evening, carefully, without squeezing too hard, because some things break if you apply too much pressure. The valet brought my car around. The night air was cool and smelled like cut grass from somewhere nearby, and the drive lined with trees was very dark beyond the reach of the club's lights. I sat in my car for a moment before pulling out. In the rearview mirror, the lights of Whitmore Country Club reflected off the fountain's water in small, scattered points. I thought about the folder, the yellow arrows pointing to the signature lines, $240,000. The cottage with my name on it that I could be outvoted out of at any time by the 4 people who held 85%. I thought about Greta, who had sat very still and said nothing, and looked at me with that unnameable expression. I thought about my granddaughter, who had looked at me from across the room with polite blankness, as though I were a stranger. Because, to her, I was. I put the car in drive. On the way home, I did not stop at the gas station on Route 12 for coffee from the machine. I drove the 40 minutes straight through in silence. No radio, no podcasts, just the dark road and the sound of the engine and my own breathing, which was slower and steadier than I would have expected. I pulled into my driveway at 10 minutes past 11. The porch light was on. I'd left it on before I went, an old habit I couldn't break, the remnant of decades of making a lit house for people who were coming home. I sat in the driveway for a moment and looked at it. Then I went inside. The house was exactly as I had left it. The ironed curtains, the stack of library books on the side table, the mug I'd rinsed and set in the dish rack before leaving, the quiet specific to a house that has held only one person for a long time. I hung up the navy dress. I sat on the edge of my bed, and I did something I hadn't done in a very long time. I picked up the phone and called Dolores, even though it was after 11, even though I could hear the surprise in her voice when she answered, even though I had been telling myself for 20 years that I was the kind of woman who handled things alone. "How was it?" she asked. I opened my mouth, and for a moment nothing came out. Because how do you compress 20 years of hope into what just happened at a country club? How do you explain to someone that the worst part wasn't even the ask? It was the realization that the ask was the point, had always been the point, that you had been invited back into a story that was never actually about you? "They want $240,000, I finally said, "for a real estate investment. That's why they invited me." Silence on the other end of the line. Then, "Oh, honey, I didn't sign anything." "Good. I said I'd think about it." "You won't, though." It wasn't a question. I looked at the dress hanging on the back of the door, the pearl buttons, the fabric that still held the faint traces of the evening, the candle smoke, the warm air of that room, the specific quality of a night that had asked everything of me and given me very little back. "No," I said. "I won't." "Are you okay?" I thought about the question, really thought about it, because Dolores deserved that. "Not entirely," I said, "but I'm clearer than I've been in 20 years. She was quiet for a moment. Outside my window, a car passed slowly down the street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling. That's something, she said. Yes, I said. That's something. I didn't sleep well that night. That would be too clean, too convenient. The woman who finally sees clearly, who sleeps deeply as a result. Instead, I lay in the dark with the events of the evening rearranging themselves over and over, and I thought about all the things I hadn't said at that table, all the things I probably should have said and didn't, all the things I said that I wasn't sure were right. And I thought about Greta, the way she'd sat so still, the expression I couldn't name, the wine glass she hadn't touched. At some point near 2 a.m, it finally came to me, the word for the expression I'd seen in her eyes. Not hostility, not calculation, not even pity. Recognition. She had looked at me the way someone looks at a situation they already know the shape of, from the inside. The way someone looks when they are watching something happen to another person that has, in some form or another, already happened to them. I didn't know what to do with that yet, but I knew enough to know it mattered. I lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling until the room lightened with the first gray of morning, and the porch light I'd left on burned steadily outside like it was still waiting for someone to come home. It was waiting for me to figure out what to do next. And somewhere between that night and the coming morning, I began to understand that for the first time in 20 years, the someone it was waiting for was not my children. It was me. I made coffee at 5:47 in the morning because there was no point pretending I was going to sleep. The kitchen was gray with early light, the kind that makes everything look like it's still deciding whether to exist. I stood at the counter in my bathrobe and watched the coffee brew and thought about nothing, which is to say I thought about everything, but kept moving my mind away from it the way you move your tongue, away from a sore tooth, aware of the damage, not ready to press on it directly. I had been awake since 2. After my call with Dolores, I'd lain in bed and watched the ceiling and turned the evening over and over in my mind, not analyzing it exactly, more just holding it, the way you hold something heavy when you can't set it down yet. At some point, I'd gotten up and made tea. I didn't drink and sat at the kitchen table in the dark and looked at my own hands for a while. Now the sun was coming up somewhere behind the clouds, and the coffee was done, and I poured a cup and sat in the chair by the window that looked out onto the garden, and I finally let myself press on the tooth. $240,000. My children had sat across a dinner table from me, in front of witnesses, with prepared documents, and asked me to hand over the entirety of my financial independence in exchange for a 15% stake in a property I could be voted out of at will. They had dressed this up in the language of family and legacy and togetherness and Mom, we've missed you. And they had calculated correctly that the longing I'd carried for 20 years would make me vulnerable to exactly that kind of language. They had known what they were doing. That was what I couldn't stop circling back to. This wasn't impulsive or careless. The folder with the documents had been in Ryan's hands before the appetizers were cleared. Victor had rehearsed his speech, the seating arrangement, the timing of the announcement, the way my name had been said in front of a room full of people. All of it had been assembled deliberately, with the specific purpose of making it harder for me to say no. My children hadn't just asked me for money. They had engineered a situation designed to extract it. The coffee was too hot to drink properly, but I drank it anyway, and outside the window a cardinal landed on the garden fence, brilliant red against the gray morning, and sat there for a moment before flying off, and I watched it go and felt something shift slightly in my chest. Not resolution, not yet, but something adjacent to it, a settling. I thought about Greta, that expression, recognition. I'd been turning that word over since 2 a.m, and I was more sure of it now than I'd been then. She had looked at me the way someone looks when they are watching a story they already know the end of, and she had sat very still and said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. I didn't know Greta. I had never met her before last night, had found out she existed through secondhand information roughly 6 years ago when someone from Ryan's old neighborhood mentioned in passing that he'd gotten married. I didn't know what her life with my son looked like from the inside. I didn't know what she'd signed, what she'd agreed to, what she'd been told to expect. But I knew that expression. And I knew that it meant she was not entirely at peace with what she had witnessed at that table. The question was whether that mattered, and if so, how. At 7:15 my phone rang. I looked at the screen expecting Dolores. She was an early riser and had a habit of following up on difficult conversations the next morning. But the name on the screen was Ryan. I stared at it for 2 full rings before answering. Ryan. Mom. His voice was different from last night. Last night he'd had the polished surface of a man in a performance. This morning he sounded tired. Whether that was genuine or another layer of the approach, I couldn't immediately tell. I wanted to call before things got... I just wanted to call. Okay, I said. Silence for a moment. I could hear sounds in the background. A kitchen, maybe? Someone moving around, a cabinet closing. Last night didn't go the way I wanted it to, he said. No, I agreed. I know how it looked. I know. He stopped, started again. Victor had a whole plan for how to present it. I told him I wasn't sure about the timing, doing it at the party, but he said it made sense to have everyone together, to make it feel like a family thing rather than just a... I don't know. He said it would feel warmer. It didn't feel warm, Ryan. I know. It felt like an ambush. Another pause. I know, he said again, and this time there was something in his voice that might have been shame or might have been frustration at being caught. I still couldn't tell the difference, and maybe there wasn't one. Why are you calling? I asked. Not unkindly, but directly. Because you're my mother, he said, and I didn't want you to. I didn't want last night to be the last time we talked. I looked out at the garden. The cardinal was gone. The fence was empty. Ryan, I said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Can you do that? Yes. Did you miss me? Before the property deal came up? Before the financing gap? Before all of this? In the years before this? Did you miss me? Or did you just miss what I could do for you? The silence that followed was the longest of the conversation, long enough that I thought he might hang up, long enough that I started to think the question itself had been unfair, that maybe I was asking him to untangle something in himself that he hadn't done the work to untangle. Then he said, I don't think I'm able to answer that cleanly. I sat with that for a moment. That's the most honest thing you've said to me in 20 years, I told him. Mom, I'm not saying it to hurt you, I mean it. That's the first thing I've heard from you that feels real. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sigh. What does that mean for... what do we do now? I'm going to think, I said. I told you and Victor that last night, and I meant it. But Ryan, I need you to understand something. I'm thinking about what is right for me, not what works for the deal, not what closes in 3 weeks. What is right for me? Can you accept that? Yes. And if the answer is no, if I decide that what's right for me is to keep my savings where they are and protect my own future, that's a legitimate decision and it doesn't make me a bad mother. A beat. I know. I'm not sure you do, but I needed to say it. We stayed on the phone for another few minutes, talking around the edges of things. He asked how the drive home had been. I asked about the kids in the vague way of someone who doesn't yet know how to ask about grandchildren she doesn't know. It was careful and awkward and entirely insufficient, but it was real in a way that the previous evening had not been. And when we hung up, I held the phone in my hands for a moment and thought, that's what it would have looked like. That's what a call from my son would have sounded like if he'd called any of the 700 times I waited for it. Imperfect and awkward and not enough and real. I set the phone down, and then I called Rebecca Hart. I had found Rebecca Hart's name 2 years earlier through a woman in my book club whose mother had recently navigated a complicated estate situation. Rebecca was an attorney who specialized in elder financial planning and asset protection. Those were the words on her website, which I had bookmarked and never acted on, the way you bookmark things you're not ready to need. She had an office in a building on Meridian Street. Nothing fancy, the kind of office that had good light and a lot of file cabinets and a plant in the corner that had been there long enough to look like it paid rent. I'd kept that bookmark for 2 years. I called at 8:30 on a Monday morning, expecting voicemail, and she answered herself. Rebecca Hart. My name is Margaret Ellis, I said. I'm not sure if you can help me, but I need to talk to someone. Tell me what's happening, she said, and her voice was the kind of voice that makes you understand immediately that you are not going to have to manage her feelings on top of your own. I told her. All of it. The party, the folder, the 240,000, the 15% that could be outvoted, Ryan's call that morning, all of it. I talked for 20 minutes without stopping, which was unusual for me, and she listened without interrupting except twice to clarify a specific detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Have you signed anything? She asked. No? Good. Don't. Not until we talk in person. She paused. Can you come in this week? Whenever you have time. Wednesday at 10. And Margaret, you were right to be suspicious of the ownership structure. What you described is a classic minority stake setup. 15% with no voting rights protections means you have financial exposure without decision-making power. That's not an investment. That's a donation with extra steps. Something in me went very quiet when she said that. Not because it was surprising. I had already understood it, intellectually, somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning when I'd run the numbers in my head. But hearing it from someone with the professional standing to say it plainly, without softening it, without arranging it around my feelings, that made it real in a different way. Wednesday at 10, I said. I'll see you then. I hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen. Then I got up, got dressed, and went out to the garden, because the weeds weren't going to pull themselves, and I had learned a long time ago that physical work was the only thing that reliably moved me through the space between a decision and its consequences. I worked in the garden for 3 hours. My hands in the dirt, the sound of birds in the fence, the particular smell of early morning in a garden that has been tended for years. There is something honest about garden work. It asks exactly what it asks, returns exactly what you give it, does not perform warmth it doesn't have. I had always found that steadying. By the time I went back inside, I had made the decision. Not because of anything new I'd thought of. I'd known the answer since 10:30 the previous night, sitting in my car in the Whitmore Country Club driveway with the fountain lights reflected in the mirror. I'd known it when I called Dolores. I had known it since I looked at Victor's ownership structure and asked the question he couldn't cleanly answer. I was not going to sign. The decision itself was not hard. What was hard was everything that surrounded it, the knowledge of what it would cost. Not financially, though it would cost something there too, in the form of whatever relationship might have been rebuilt on different terms. The knowledge that saying no to the money meant saying no to the cottage with my name on it, and the grandchildren on the beach, and the version of the future that Chloe had described in those 12 careful minutes at the party. Knowing that the version of things that had been offered, however cynically packaged, was the only version currently on the table. There was grief in that. I won't pretend there wasn't. But grief and error are not the same thing. You can grieve a decision that is still the right one. Chloe called on Tuesday afternoon. She was warmer than she'd been in 20 years, and more anxious than she'd been at the party, and those two things together told me something about where we actually stood. She talked about the property for a while, and then she talked around it, and eventually she said, "Mom, I just want to make sure you know that this is real, that we want this, not just the financial piece. We want you back." "Chloe," I said, "when was the last time before the invitation that you thought about calling me?" Silence. "I'm not asking to punish you," I said. "I'm asking because the answer matters. Because if the answer is that you thought about it and talked yourself out of it, that's one thing. If the answer is that you didn't think about it at all until the property needed funding, that's something else." "It's not, Mom, it's complicated. You and I have always been complicated," I said. "I know. I've been hearing that word a lot this week. I don't know what you want me to say." "I know you don't. That's actually part of the problem." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that I've thought about many times since. "I do miss you, I think. But I don't know if I miss you or if I miss having a mother. I don't know if those are the same thing." I held that sentence in my hands very carefully. "They're not," I said. "But thank you for being honest about it. Does that mean you're not going to—" "It means I'm going to meet with an attorney on Wednesday. And after that, I'm going to make my decision." She didn't push after that. I think she heard something in my voice that told her pushing would not be productive. We talked for another 10 minutes about nothing particular, and then she said goodbye, and I held the phone after she hung up and felt the specific, complicated weight of loving a person who has not yet figured out how to love you back in a way that doesn't cost you everything. Wednesday morning, I drove to Rebecca Hart's office and sat across from her at a desk covered in organized stacks of paper and a coffee mug that said, "I survived probate," in faded letters. She was in her 50s, compact and efficient, with the direct manner of someone who has spent decades watching families come apart over money and has developed a corresponding impatience with euphemism. "Tell me about your current financial structure," she said, and we spent the first 20 minutes going through the specifics. My pension, my savings, my house, which I owned outright. She listened, made notes, asked precise questions. Then she looked up. "You're in a better position than most people who come in here after something like this," she said. "You own your home. You have a pension that covers your basics, and your savings are liquid and fully in your control. The reason what they proposed is dangerous for you specifically is that handing over that amount would eliminate your emergency cushion and your independence buffer simultaneously. If anything went wrong, medically, mechanically, anything, you'd have no reserve. You'd be dependent on them, which, given what you've described, is not a position I'd recommend." "No," I said. "It isn't." "So you're not signing?" "No." She nodded, not with approval exactly, more with the efficiency of someone crossing off a box. "Then let's talk about what you do want. Because protection isn't just about saying no to bad offers, it's about building something they can't reach." We talked for another hour and a half about restructuring how my assets were held, about updating documents, powers of attorney, healthcare directives, things I had avoided thinking about because thinking about them meant thinking about getting older and what that looked like alone, about the specific legal mechanisms that existed to make sure that if I ever became vulnerable, the people with access to my life were the people I chose, not the people who showed up when they needed something. It was not a comfortable conversation. It required looking at realities I had been gently averting my eyes from for years. But Rebecca Hart did not allow comfortable avoidance. She was not unkind, but she was thorough. And by the time we finished, I had a list of things to do and a court date to update my estate documents and the name of a financial advisor she trusted. Walking out of her office into the afternoon sun, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel: purpose. Not happiness. This was not a happy week, but a sense of forward motion, of being in the process of doing something rather than waiting for something to happen to me. I called Ryan that afternoon, not to discuss the decision. I wasn't ready for that conversation yet, wasn't sure how it would land, but because something had been sitting with me since his Monday call, since the thing he'd said about not being able to answer cleanly, I'd been thinking about it in the spaces between everything else. He answered on the second ring. "Ryan," I said, "I'm not calling about the property. I'm calling because I want to know something about Greta." A small pause. "What about her?" She was very quiet at the party. She didn't say much, and the way she looked at me, "I want to know if she's okay." The pause this time was longer. "Why do you ask?" "Because she had an expression I recognized, and I can't stop thinking about it." Another pause, then, "She and I things have been difficult between us for a while." Has she had reservations about this? About the property plan? The silence before his answer told me as much as the answer itself. "She didn't think it was the right way to approach you," he said. "She said so, more than once." I closed my eyes briefly. "Your wife told you not to do this the way you did it," I said slowly, "and you did it anyway." Victor had a plan. "Ryan." I stopped, took a breath. "I'm not angry. I'm past angry. But I want you to hear me. The person in your life who was right about this was Greta, not Victor. Greta. And if she's been telling you the right thing and you've been listening to the wrong people, that's a problem that goes beyond me." He didn't say anything for a long moment. "She wanted to reach out to you differently," he finally said. "She's talked about it. She thought we should have just called and said we wanted to reconnect. She thought the property thing could come later, or not at all." She was right. "I know." "Listen to her," I said. "Not about me. About everything. Whatever this pattern is, where you take direction from Victor over your own wife and your own instincts, that's going to cost you more than a real estate deal. I hadn't planned to say any of that. It came out with the directness of something that had been sitting at pressure for a while, and I expected him to push back, to get defensive, to retreat behind "it's complicated" the way he had before. Instead, he said, very quietly, "I know." I sat with that. "I'll let you know about the property by end of the week," I said. "Mom, whatever you decide, He stopped. Started again. "I'm sorry for the way it was done. I'm sorry." Those 3 words. I had waited 20 years for some version of them, had imagined them in 100 different settings and voices, had rehearsed how I would feel when they finally arrived. I had imagined feeling flooded with relief, or breaking down, or feeling some massive internal shift like a weather system moving through. What I actually felt was something smaller and more complicated, something that needed to be handled carefully, like an object that might still be sharp. "Thank you," I said. "That matters." Not "it's okay." It was not okay, but it mattered. The call with Victor happened Thursday, and it did not go the way Ryan's had. Victor called at 7 in the evening, which I thought was a deliberate choice. Evening calls carry a different pressure than morning ones, a sense of the day ending, of urgency. His voice had lost the warm performance quality and had taken on something more direct, less patient. "Margaret, I want to be straightforward with you," he said, which was interesting because it implied the previous conversations had not been. "The closing timeline is real. We need an answer by Friday." "I'll have one," I said. "I want to make sure you understand what's at stake. This isn't just a financial opportunity. This is a chance to repair something, to be part of this family again. If you decline—" "Victor," I said, "are you telling me that my place in this family is contingent on whether I write a check?" Silence. "Because if that's what you're telling me," I continued, "I'd like you to say it clearly, not as a threat, not as a negotiation tactic. Just say the plain thing. Does my family want me in it regardless, or does the invitation expire when the deal does?" A very long pause. "That's not—" He stopped. "I'm saying that this is a meaningful opportunity that won't wait indefinitely." That's not an answer to my question. He didn't give me one. We ended the call shortly after, in the particular cold politeness of 2 people who have run out of things to say to each other that aren't the thing neither is willing to say directly. I sat in my kitchen after I hung up and was very still for a long time. Then I got up and I made dinner. Nothing elaborate, pasta with olive oil and the last of the cherry tomatoes from the garden, a glass of water, the kitchen smelling of garlic, and the particular satisfying smell of something simple being cooked well. I ate at the table with the lights on, and the window dark beside me, and the sounds of the neighborhood coming in faintly through the glass. And I thought about what Victor hadn't said. He hadn't said, "The family wants you regardless." He hadn't said, "You are welcome here whether or not you invest." He had talked around it, had offered words that sounded like reassurance without being it, had deflected the direct question with the practiced ease of a man who had built a career on exactly that skill. His silence was the answer. I had suspected it since the party. Now I knew it. The invitation, the cottage, the grandchildren on the beach, the future Chloe had described in those careful 12 minutes, all of it was conditional. All of it had a price attached. Not a 15% stake, a 100% stake. All of me, delivered without reservation, in exchange for a place at the table I had once sat at as a matter of right, simply by being their mother. That night, I slept better than I had in 4 days. Not well. I still woke at 3 and lay in the dark for a while, but better. Something had been settled that had been unsettled. Not resolved, not repaired. Just named. Finally, accurately, without the distortion of hope, named. The next morning, Friday, I called Ryan first. "I'm not going to be able to contribute to the property purchase," I said. "I want to be clear that this is a financial decision made in my own best interest, and it is final. I won't be revisiting it." He was quiet. "I also want to say," I continued, "that if you and Chloe want a relationship with me going forward, I am open to that. but it would have to be built differently than this week was built. From honesty, not from need. From actual reaching out, not from deals that need closing. I paused. I would like to know my grandchildren, Ryan. That's true, and it has nothing to do with money. But that has to be offered freely, not as part of a package. He said, okay. Just that. Okay. Talk to Greta, I said. I think she might have more to say than you've been hearing. After I hung up, I called Chloe and said essentially the same things. Her response was more emotional. There were tears, some of them sounding genuine, some of them sounding like the grief of losing a deal she had been counting on. Both things were probably true at once. Chloe had always been able to feel two things simultaneously without either one canceling the other out. I used to find that exasperating. Standing on the other side of it now, I thought it might actually be the most human thing about her. I did not call Victor. Saturday morning, I went back to the garden. The day was clear and warm for the season, the kind of late autumn day that feels like a gift that wasn't promised, and I worked for a long time pulling the last of the summer plants and turning the soil for spring. My hands were dirty and my knees ached, and the light was very good, and the bird that had come to the fence every morning that week, the cardinal, brilliant and unbothered, came back and sat and watched me work. I was 63 years old, and my children had tried to take the last solid thing I had built for myself. And I had said no. It hadn't been easy. I want to be clear about that. There's a version of this story where the no comes cleanly, where the woman straightens her spine and says the word without cost, and that's not my story. My no came from a place of genuine grief, of wanting things to be different than they were, of loving people who had not loved me well and having to make peace with the gap between those two facts. But it had come. That was the thing. For 20 years, I had been the kind of woman who waited for calls that didn't come, for apologies that weren't offered, for the door to open from the other side. I had built my whole quiet life around that waiting without fully acknowledging it was what I was doing. And now I had done something different. Now I had acted, called an attorney, made decisions, protected something. Now I was the one who had set the terms. And it had cost me something real, the last version of the hope I'd been carrying, but it had given me something in return that I was still figuring out how to name. Dolores appeared at the garden gate around noon with sandwiches wrapped in paper and a thermos of coffee. She did not knock or call ahead. She just appeared, the way she always did when she understood that something had happened. "Well?" she said, settling into the chair I kept by the garden table, unwrapping both sandwiches with the efficiency of a woman who had fed people through difficult things before and knew the first step was just feeding them. I said no, I told her. She handed me a sandwich. And I called a lawyer, and I've started fixing some things that needed fixing. I looked out at the turned earth of the garden bed, dark and ready, and I think I'm going to sell the house. She looked up from her sandwich. What? I've been thinking about it for a while. Even before all this. This house is too big for me, and it's full of waiting. I've been waiting in it for 20 years. I took a bite of the sandwich, turkey, mustard, the kind she knew I liked. There's a town on the coast, Marin's Bluff. I drove through it about 4 years ago, just passing through, and I've thought about it almost every week since. Dolores looked at me for a long moment with the particular expression she had when she was deciding whether to argue with me. Tell me about this town, she finally said. Small, quiet, right on the water. There's an art community there. I looked it up last year. Pottery, painting, that kind of thing. The houses are reasonable because it's not a tourist town, it's just where people live. I paused. I want to learn to paint. I've wanted to for 30 years and I've kept putting it off because I don't know why. Because I was waiting for something else to happen first. And now? Now I'm done waiting for something else to happen first. Dolores ate her sandwich. The cardinal came back to the fence. The afternoon light moved slowly across the garden. I'm going to miss you, she said finally. I want that on the record. I'm not going anywhere tomorrow. But you're going. Yes, I said. I'm going. She nodded. Good, she said, and her voice was gruff in the way it got when she was feeling something she didn't intend to let become a whole thing. About time. We ate in the good silence of people who don't need to fill everything with words. The light came down through the trees at the edge of the garden, and the turned earth waited for spring, and somewhere beyond the fence a car passed, and somewhere further than that, my children were living their lives without my money in them. And I was sitting in a garden that belonged to me, eating a sandwich my neighbor had brought, making plans. For the first time in 20 years, the plans were only mine. The house sold in 6 weeks. I had expected it to take longer. The market was unpredictable and the house was small, and the neighborhood was quiet in the way that appeals to some people and says nothing to others. But a couple in their late 30s came through on the second showing, a woman who taught high school history and her husband who worked from home, and they stood in my garden for 20 minutes pointing at things and talking to each other in low voices with the particular energy of people who have already decided and are just confirming it. The offer came in 3 days later. Reasonable. Fair. I accepted it without negotiating, which Rebecca Hart told me I probably should have done, but I didn't have the appetite for it. I wanted the house to go to people who would fill it with something other than waiting, and those two felt like the right people for that. I signed the papers on a Tuesday in December, in a title company office that smelled like carpet cleaner and burnt coffee, with a notary named Frank who had the pleasant, inexpressive face of a man who had witnessed the signing away of thousands of lives' worth of accumulated history and had long ago made peace with the weight of it. My hand didn't shake when I signed. I had thought it might. It didn't. Dolores came to help me pack. She showed up on a Saturday with boxes she'd gotten from the liquor store, the good kind, small and sturdy, and a roll of packing tape she wore on her wrist like a bracelet. And she worked beside me for 2 full days without making it into anything more than what it was. We packed the kitchen and the books and the things from the bedroom and the garden tools I was taking with me, and the photographs, which took the longest because each one required a small decision: keep or let go, carry forward or leave behind. There were photographs of Chloe and Ryan. Of course there were. Chloe at 7 with a gap-toothed smile and paint on her hands from a school project. Ryan at 12 in his soccer uniform, squinting into the sun. Both of them at Ryan's high school graduation, standing on either side of me, everyone in that photograph appearing to believe that the next 20 years would look nothing like they did. I kept them all. I want to be clear about that, because this is not a story about erasing people. I kept every photograph and wrapped them in paper and put them in a box marked "Handle with Care," which Dolores labeled herself with a marker, quietly, without comment. The morning I left, I walked through every room alone. It was early January, the light coming in flat and gray through windows I had cleaned for the last time the week before. The house was empty in the particular way of a space that has been lived in and then vacated. Not dead exactly, but holding its breath, waiting for whoever came next. I stood in the kitchen for a while. I stood in the doorway of the smaller bedroom that had been a guest room for years, and before that, for 2 short years before Chloe left for college, her bedroom. The walls still the faint yellow she had chosen at 14, and that I had never repainted because repainting it would have required acknowledging that she wasn't coming back. I stood there for a long time. Then I walked out, pulled the door closed behind me, and drove away. Marin's Bluff was 4 hours south and slightly east, close enough to the coast that you could smell the salt in the air a full mile before you saw water. I had driven through it exactly once, 4 years earlier, on my way back from a teacher's retirement conference in Wilmington, and I had stopped for gas and then, almost on a reflex, kept driving slowly through the town's small center instead of taking the highway back. 2 streets of old storefronts, a library with a hand-painted sign, a coffee shop with outdoor tables even in November, a gallery with ceramics in the window, a harbor at the end of the main street, small boats, working boats mostly, the kind that go out early and come back smelling like the sea. I had thought about it almost every week since. That was the part I couldn't explain to people. Not that I had liked the town. Plenty of places are likable, but that it had stayed with me, uninvited, returning in the margins of ordinary days like something I had agreed to come back to without realizing I'd made the agreement. The rental I had arranged was a small house 2 blocks from the water. Older, with a covered porch that faced a garden gone to winter sleep, and windows that let in an enormous amount of light. It wasn't perfect. The kitchen was narrow. The second bedroom was more of a large closet. The bathroom fixtures were 20 years past fashionable. But the light was extraordinary, and the porch was deep enough to sit on in rain, and when I stood in the front room the afternoon I arrived and looked out at the bare winter garden, something in my chest settled in a way I hadn't expected. Not happiness. Something quieter than happiness. Something more reliable. I was not naive about what I had come here to do. I had come here to build something from scratch at 63, which is not the age at which anyone imagines starting over, and which carries its own specific difficulties. I knew no one in Marin's Bluff. I had no structure, no schedule that anyone else depended on, no reason to leave the house on any given day except my own volition. For a person who had spent 30 years with her days organized around a classroom full of 10-year-olds, that kind of open space was not immediately comfortable. It was in fact frightening in the plain and ordinary way of things that require you to trust yourself without anyone else's structure to lean on. The first 2 weeks were hard. I'm not going to pretend they weren't. I unpacked my boxes and arranged my furniture and learned which burner on the stove ran hot and which cabinet door didn't close all the way, and I walked to the harbor every morning because it gave the day a shape, and I talked to Dolores on the phone every evening because her voice was the primary thing tethering me to the familiar. I read. I cooked slowly, the kind of cooking that takes time because the time is the point. I bought watercolor supplies from a small art shop 2 blocks from the harbor, tubes of paint, 3 brushes, a pad of heavy paper, and set them on the kitchen table where I could see them without having to commit to actually using them yet. I was lonely. I want to say that plainly, because the honest version of this story requires it. There is a kind of loneliness specific to a new place, where you are surrounded by the ordinary life of a community, people going to work, children at the bus stop, neighbors waving from driveways, and you are adjacent to all of it, but not yet inside it. A watcher of other people's routines while yours is still forming. It is not the crushing loneliness of true isolation. It is the manageable, uncomfortable loneliness of a person in the process of becoming part of something they aren't part of yet. I held on to that distinction. In the process of, not finished, not stuck, moving, even when it didn't feel like it. In the 3rd week, I started painting. Not well. I want to be absolutely clear about that. The first things I produced were embarrassing in the way that all first attempts are embarrassing. Muddy with overworked color, the shapes uncertain, the proportions wrong in ways I couldn't identify but could feel. I painted the view from the kitchen window, the porch railing, the garden beyond it, the narrow strip of sky above the fence. I painted it 4 times in a week, and all 4 versions looked like they had been produced by someone with determination and no particular talent, which was accurate. I kept going anyway. There is something about the act of making something with your hands, something physical and immediate that exists in the world the moment you put it down, that doesn't require anyone's approval to be real, that I had been missing for longer than I'd known. Teaching had given me something like it, the immediate return of a child's face when something clicks, the small daily satisfaction of work that matters in a tangible way. But I'd been retired for 6 years, and in those 6 years I had tended my garden and read my books and managed my quiet life, and I hadn't made anything. I had maintained. I had waited. Painting was the opposite of waiting. In the 5th week, I signed up for a class. The Marin's Bluff Arts Collective met in a converted boathouse at the end of the harbor, Tuesday and Thursday mornings, 9 to noon. The instructor was a woman named Patrice, who was in her early 70s and had the direct, slightly impatient manner of someone who had been teaching long enough to stop softening the truth. She looked at my first attempts without flinching. "You're overworking it," she said. "You keep painting after the painting is done. Stop before you think you're finished." "How do I know when that is?" "You don't, for a while. That's the part you have to learn." I liked her immediately. The class had 7 regular students, women mostly, ranging in age from a retired nurse named Carolyn to a woman in her 40s named Deb, who made her living selling real estate and painted, she said, to remember that she was a person and not just a transaction. They were not my friends yet, those first weeks. They were the people I nodded at when I arrived and said goodbye to when I left, the people whose names I was learning and whose habits I was beginning to recognize. But they were there, twice a week, and their presence and Patrice's direct instructions and the specific smell of paint and salt air in that boathouse gave my Tuesdays and Thursdays a shape that gradually extended to the days around them. This is how community happens, I was learning, not in dramatic moments of connection, but in the accumulation of small ones. The second time Carolyn saved me the spot by the good window without being asked. The Tuesday Deb brought in extra coffee because she'd made too much and handed it to me without making it a thing. The morning Patrice looked at a painting of mine, a study of the harbor in early light, nothing special, still imperfect, and said without looking up from her own work, "That's better. You stopped before you ruined it." I had put that small sentence in my chest and carried it the rest of the week. It was in the 6th week that the letter arrived. I almost didn't open it, not because I didn't recognize the handwriting. I recognized it immediately, which was the problem. Ryan's handwriting, careful and slightly cramped the way it had always been, the way it was when he was 10 years old writing thank you notes at the kitchen table in the yellow house while I stood over him making sure he didn't rush. The postmark was from his city. The envelope was thick. I set it on the kitchen table and made coffee and looked at it from across the room for 20 minutes before I sat down and opened it. Inside was a letter, 4 pages handwritten, and a photograph. The photograph was of Ryan and Greta and their children, Eli and Sophie, my grandchildren who didn't know me, taken somewhere outdoors, a park maybe, everyone in winter coats, everyone squinting slightly into a low sun. It was an ordinary family photograph, the kind you take on a Sunday afternoon when the weather is decent and someone thinks to bring a camera, and there was nothing staged about it. Sophie had one hand raised to shield her eyes. Eli had his hands in his pockets and was half turned away. Greta was looking at the camera but not quite smiling, the expression of a woman with a great deal on her mind. Ryan was looking at his kids. I sat with that photograph for a long time before I read the letter. The letter was not polished. That was the first thing I noticed. It did not have the prepared, managed quality of his phone calls, did not feel like something that had been reviewed and edited. It felt like someone sitting down and writing without stopping, which is not always pretty, but is always real. He wrote about the property deal falling through. Victor had found another investor, a business partner, someone outside the family, and the purchase had closed without my contribution. He wrote that without apparent resentment, which surprised me. He wrote that Greta had told him something after the party, after my calls, something she had apparently been sitting on for a long time, that she had never agreed with the way the family had handled things with me. Not just the party, not just the ask, the whole 20 years. She had told him, the letter said, that she had watched him become someone who followed Victor's lead on everything and his own instincts on nothing, and that she was afraid of where that was going, not just for her and Ryan, but for their children, who were learning from watching. He wrote, "She said our kids are going to treat us the way they watch us treat people." I didn't want to hear it. I heard it anyway. He wrote that they had started seeing a couples counselor. He wrote that it was uncomfortable and that he didn't like talking about himself in the particular way that therapy required, but that Greta had asked him to try, and he owed her that much. He wrote that the counselor had asked him, in the second session, when he had last done something his mother would have been proud of, and that he hadn't been able to answer, and that not being able to answer had been worse than anything. He wrote, "I don't know how to fix 20 years. I don't think you can fix 20 years, but Greta thinks we should try something smaller first. She thinks we should try a phone call, a regular one, not about anything, just talking. She said that's how you start." He wrote, "Sophie asked me last week if she had a grandmother. I didn't know what to tell her. I told her yes. I told her your name. She said it out loud, Margaret, and I don't know why, but I cried after she went to bed. I'm not sure what I was crying about. Maybe everything." The letter ended without a request. That was the part that got me. No ask, no deal, no folder, no timeline. Just, "I hope Marin's Bluff is what you needed. Greta says it sounds like the right kind of place. She also says to tell you she's sorry she didn't say anything at the party. She said she should have." I read the letter 3 times. Then I set it down and looked out the kitchen window at the winter garden, at the bare branches and the gray sky and the strip of pale light at the horizon that meant the water was close even if I couldn't see it from here. I thought about the photograph. Sophie's hand raised against the sun. Ryan looking at his kids. I cried. Not the grief crying of the party, not the exhausted crying of those first nights after. Something different. Something that felt like a pressure releasing, slowly, the way the air goes out of something that has been sealed for too long. I was not ready to call it hope. I had learned what hope could cost when it wasn't grounded in anything real. But there was something in that letter that felt different from the things that had come before it, something that had not been calculated, something that had been written by a person who was, imperfectly and belatedly and without any guarantee of a particular outcome, trying. I wrote back. 4 days later, on a Sunday morning, I sat at the kitchen table with the watercolors pushed to one side and a legal pad in front of me, and I wrote. I did not make it easy. I want to be honest about that. I am not built for easy, and I have stopped apologizing for it. I wrote that I was glad he'd written, but that I was not prepared to pretend the last 20 years hadn't happened, because they had happened, and they had shaped me, and I was not going to compress them into something forgivable just because forgiving it would be more comfortable for everyone. I wrote that I needed things to be different, specifically and concretely different, and that if a regular phone call was where he wanted to start, I was willing to try that, but I needed him to understand that I was no longer in the business of being available on terms set by other people. I wrote, You have a wife who has been telling you the right things. Listen to her, not for me, for yourself. I wrote, I would like to know Sophie and Eli. That is true and it comes without conditions, but it has to be built slowly, because I am a stranger to them, and they to me, and that is a gap that was created deliberately and will take time to close. I'm willing to take that time. I need to know you are too. I wrote, I'm learning to paint. I'm not good at it yet, but I'm not stopping. I signed it. Mom. The first phone call happened 2 weeks later, a Tuesday evening, Patrice's class still faintly present in my hands and the smell of paint I hadn't quite washed off. Ryan called at 7 as we'd arranged, and the call lasted 42 minutes, and most of it was awkward in the specific way of people who know each other's most fundamental facts and none of the ordinary ones. I didn't know what he had for breakfast, or what shows he watched, or what his commute was like. He didn't know about Patrice or Carolyn or Deb or the boathouse that smelled like salt and paint. We were strangers with a shared history, which is one of the hardest things there is to navigate. But we stayed on the phone for 42 minutes, and we made plans for the next call, the following Tuesday, same time. That was enough. For now, that was enough. Chloe called on a Thursday, 2 weeks after Ryan's letter arrived, and her call was harder. She cried for the first 10 minutes, not performatively. Or if it started that way, it stopped being that quickly, became something raw and less controlled. She said she had been doing things she wasn't proud of for a long time, following Victor's lead on things she should have questioned, choosing the comfortable version of events over the truthful one. She said she knew the party had been wrong. She said, I kept telling myself that if you just came back into our lives, it would fix things, that having you there would make everything feel more, more legitimate. More like a real family, I said. Yes. Chloe, having me there wouldn't have fixed whatever is broken between you and the version of yourself you used to be. That's your work to do. I can't do it for you. A long silence. I know, she said. And I need to say something that is going to be hard to hear, I continued, because I had decided I was done with the version of conversations that protected people from the things they needed to hear. You are married to a man who orchestrated an ambush of your mother at a dinner party in front of witnesses and used the 20 years of longing he knew I was carrying to try to extract $250,000 from me. That is not a small thing, Chloe. That tells you something about who he is and what he's capable of. And what you choose to do with that information is your business, not mine. But I need you to at least see it clearly. She was very quiet. I see it, she finally said. I've been seeing it for a while, in a lot of different ways. I didn't push further. It wasn't my marriage and it wasn't my life to redirect. But I had said the plain thing, and it was out in the air between us, and that mattered. We talked for almost an hour. At the end, she asked if she could call again. Yes, I said. Same rules as your brother. No deals, no timelines, just talking. Just talking, she repeated, and there was something in her voice, relief, I think, at the simplicity of it. The legal situation arrived in March, which I had half expected and Rebecca Hart had fully expected. Victor filed a claim, not against me precisely, but in the form of a demand letter suggesting that I had verbally committed to the investment at the party and subsequently withdrawn, causing financial damages to the partnership. It was thin, legally, and Rebecca told me so within 20 minutes of my sending her the scanned documents. "This is a pressure tactic," she said, in the flat tone she used for things that did not require emotional investment. "He's hoping you'll find it intimidating enough to settle with some partial contribution just to make it go away." The verbal commitment claim has essentially no standing. There's nothing signed, no witness testimony that could establish a binding agreement, and the documented facts of the situation don't support it. What do I need to do? Nothing, for now. I'll respond. It'll be a short letter. This goes away. You're sure? I've been doing this for 23 years, she said. Sure. She was right. The demand was answered, countered with a clean legal response, and the follow-up never came. Victor did not escalate. Whether that was because his attorneys advised him against it, or because Ryan had something to say about it, or simply because the math didn't justify it, I never found out. The whole thing resolved in 2 weeks and then was over. And I was left sitting at my kitchen table in Marin's Bluff with a cup of coffee and the particular feeling of having survived something that had tried to use the legal system as a weapon and failed because I had built actual defenses around myself before it arrived. That feeling was different from anything I'd felt in the years of waiting. In the years of waiting, I had always been in a position of receiving whatever came. Now I was in a position of having prepared, having acted, having protected something. Rebecca Hart had done the technical work, yes, but I had called her. I had sat in her office. I had answered her questions honestly and done the things she'd recommended and kept the paperwork organized. I had taken care of myself. That sounds simple. It wasn't. Spring came to Marin's Bluff in April and came slowly, the way it does on the coast. The warmth arriving in tentative increments, retreating overnight, then advancing again. The garden at my rental started producing things I hadn't planted, the previous tenants' bulbs coming up without asking permission. I didn't know what half of them were, and I didn't look them up. I just let them arrive. My Tuesday and Thursday mornings in Patrice's class had accumulated into something recognizable. I was not good at painting, but I was better than I had been. And more importantly, I was engaged with the being better in a way that had nothing to do with achievement and everything to do with attention. Patrice had told me, in one of her abrupt Tuesday observations, that I was too focused on what the painting was going to be and not enough on what it was right now, and that the result was that I was always trying to correct for a future version instead of working with the present one. You're always trying to fix tomorrow's problem, she said. Paint what's in front of you now. I thought about that for a long time, not just as it applied to paint. Carolyn had become a friend by then, in the real sense. We had coffee after class on Thursdays, and she told me things about her life. Her late husband, her daughter in Portland who called twice a week and visited twice a year, the retirement that had taken her 3 years to figure out how to inhabit. And I told her things about mine, not everything. The weight of the Whitmore party and the documents and Victor's demand letter was not something I unloaded casually, but the shape of it, the broad outline. You did the right thing, she said one Thursday, after I had told her enough. I know, I said. It's still hard. It's allowed to be both, she said, and that was the kind of thing Carolyn said that made me grateful for her existence in my life. In May, I had a video call with Sophie. It had been Ryan's suggestion, carefully made, offered without pressure. Greta had talked to Sophie beforehand, apparently, had told her she had a grandmother and that her name was Margaret, and that she lived near the ocean. Sophie had, according to Ryan, said, "Does she have a dog?" She did not have a dog, and Ryan had laughed when he told me that, and his laugh was the most natural thing I'd heard from him since all of this began. Sophie appeared on the screen with the uninhibited directness of a 9-year-old who has not yet learned to manage her expressions for other people's comfort. She looked at me for a moment and then said, "You look like Dad around the eyes." "I'll take that as a compliment," I said. "It is one," she said very seriously. "Dad has nice eyes." We talked for 22 minutes. She told me about her class hamster, whose name was Brigadier, and about a book she was reading that I hadn't read, and she explained to me with great thoroughness, and about the fact that she was learning to play the violin and had been doing so for 3 months, and it was very hard, and she was not sure she liked it, but her mother said she had to keep going for at least a year before deciding. My mother made me take piano, I told her. I hated it for the first year and then I loved it. She looked at me with frank assessment. Did you get good? Decent, not great. That's honest, she said, nodding, apparently approving of this. At the end of the call, she said, Will you call again? Yes, I said. Every other Sunday, if that works. Okay. She waved at the screen with the slightly awkward wave of a child who doesn't do video calls much. Bye, Margaret? She hadn't called me Grandma. I hadn't expected her to. That was a thing that would come in its own time or it wouldn't, and either way it had to be real before it was named. But she had said she'd talk again. That was enough. Eli took longer. He was 12 and wary, and looked at me in the video call Ryan arranged in June with the careful guardedness of a boy who has learned to wait before deciding how he feels about things. I recognized that quality immediately. I had seen it in Ryan at the same age, the same measured holding back. We talked for 12 minutes the first time, mostly me asking questions and him giving answers that were complete but not elaborate. He told me he liked history, specifically military history, specifically naval history. I told him the town I lived in had a small maritime museum that had artifacts from a 19th century shipwreck found 3 miles offshore. He paused. What kind of artifacts? Navigation instruments. Part of the hull. A cargo manifest. Some personal items from the crew. Have you been? Not yet. I was waiting for a reason to go. He looked at me through the screen, and for just a moment the guardedness shifted slightly, and I saw underneath it the shape of a kid who was interested in the world and trying to decide if I was safe to be interested with. Maybe I could go sometime, he said. When we visit. I'd like that, I said. He nodded and looked away, but not before I saw the small thing that happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something in that direction. I held that in my hands all week. The summer in Marin's Bluff was the best I'd had in longer than I could accurately remember, and I say that knowing it was imperfect, and that imperfect is not the same as insufficient. The class continued through June, paused in July when Patrice took a trip to see her sister in New Mexico, and resumed in August with a new session that added 3 new students, including a man in his late 60s named Arthur, who had retired from structural engineering and approached watercolor with the systematic precision of someone solving a problem, which Patrice found both amusing and instructive to dismantle. I was painting things I recognized now. Harbor Light, the roof line of the building across the street, the Winter Garden in its spring transformation, documented week by week in a series I hadn't planned to make, but that had accumulated on its own. Patrice had looked at 3 of them together one Tuesday and said, without stopping to make a production of it, "These belong in the show." The collective had a small exhibition every October. Work from all the classes hung in the boathouse and open to the public for a weekend. I had been to the previous years as a visitor and stood in front of other people's work and felt the specific quiet excitement of a person in the presence of something real. "My work?" I said. "Your work," Patrice said, and turned back to the student she'd been helping. I drove home from class that Tuesday and sat on the porch for a long time in the warm August air, and I thought about that, about the particular fact of something I had made being seen by other people, not for their approval. I had spent too much of my life trying to deserve other people's approval to be interested in pursuing it as a goal, but for the simple human fact of having made something and put it into the world, of having taken 63 years of life and the grief of it and the garden and the harbor light and the long, complicated love I had for my imperfect children, and turned some portion of all of it into marks on paper that a stranger could stand in front of and feel something they couldn't quite name. That was not nothing. It was, in fact, quite a lot. In September, Ryan and Greta and the children came to Marin's Bluff for a weekend. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because the version of me that existed before the party, before Rebecca Hart, before the navy dress, and the folder, and the night I spent lying awake listening to the sound of my own breathing, that version of me would have made this visit into a referendum, would have watched every interaction for evidence of whether I was being loved correctly, would have measured every moment against the 20 years of absence, would have needed the weekend to prove something. The version of me that had spent 8 months learning to stop before the painting was ruined was, I think, better at this. It was not a perfect weekend. Eli was quiet the first day and gradually became less so. Sophie was a force of nature who had very specific opinions about everything and expressed them without apology, which I found deeply endearing. Greta and I were careful with each other in the way of two people who respect the difficulty of their position and are choosing good faith over performance. Ryan and I had one hard conversation on Saturday evening, on the porch after the kids were asleep, in which he said things he'd been trying to say on the phone for months and which landed differently in person. In the specific physical space of being in the same place at the same time as someone you're trying to find your way back to. He said, "I don't know how to make up for it. I've thought about that a lot and I genuinely don't know." "You can't make up for it," I said. "You can't go back. Neither of us can." "Then what do? We do what's in front of us. We do this." I gestured at the porch, the dark garden, the distant sound of water. "We show up." He was quiet for a long moment. "Is that enough?" "I don't know yet," I said, "but it's where we start." He nodded slowly. He looked like a man who was tired of the distance between himself and the person he might have been and was beginning the long, unglamorous work of closing it. That work was his to do. I couldn't do it for him, but I could be present for it, at a distance that felt safe, with boundaries that were mine to set. Sunday morning, I took the kids to the Maritime Museum. Eli read every placard in the building. Not performed interest, real interest, the kind that makes a person oblivious to the time passing. Sophie got a ship and a bottle from the gift shop and spent the drive back to my house trying to figure out how it was made, proposing increasingly elaborate theories that Eli dismantled methodically, and that she then rebuilt with unfazed confidence. I drove them and listened and felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time, so long that it took me a moment to identify it. I felt like a grandmother, not the version of a grandmother from a catalog, warm and softly lit, everything resolved. Just the real thing. A woman in her 60s driving her grandchildren home from a museum, listening to them argue about ships and bottles, finding all of it funny and exhausting and completely, unexpectedly full of life. The weekend ended on Sunday afternoon. They loaded into their rental car in front of my house, and Greta hugged me with real warmth. The first real hug I'd received from that family since this all began, and said quietly into my ear, "Thank you for being willing to try." "Thank you for telling him to call me," I said, "and for the things you said at the party that none of us heard." She pulled back and looked at me with that expression I had first seen across a dinner table in November, the one I had finally named as recognition. "I heard you," she said. "I always heard you." Eli shook my hand, very seriously, like a small diplomat. Sophie hugged me with the total physical commitment of a child who has decided you're worth hugging, no qualifications, no held backness, just all of her at once. "Bye, Grandma Margaret," she said. I had not expected that. I stood on the sidewalk after their car turned the corner and felt the words settle into me, not as something I had earned exactly, but as something that had been offered freely, without condition, by a 9-year-old who had decided I was worth the word, and whose instincts on the matter were better than most adults. I went inside. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the watercolors stacked on the counter, ready for the October show. I looked at the garden through the window, the late summer growth, the plants the previous tenant had left that had come up all spring and summer and that I now knew the names of because I had looked them up after all. I looked at the photograph of Sophie and Eli and Ryan and Greta that I had put on the refrigerator after Ryan had sent it, next to the older photographs I had brought from the house in a box marked "Handle with care." All the photographs together, the gap-toothed 7-year-old Chloe and the squinting 12-year-old Ryan and the woman in the middle of them at a graduation who believed the future was a more forgiving place than it would turn out to be. And the new photograph, the park, the winter coats, the low sun, the family that existed now, imperfect and incomplete, and still in the process of figuring out what it was. All of it on the same refrigerator, all of it true. I want to talk to you now, directly. The way I wish someone had talked to me a long time ago, before I spent 20 years waiting for permission to take up space in my own life. Here's what I know. Love is not a debt that can be called in. If someone comes to you after years of silence, not with apology but with paperwork, not with genuine reckoning but with a deal that benefits them and asks everything of you, that is not love returning. That is love being counterfeited, and the difference matters, and you are allowed to know the difference. Your independence, the financial kind, the emotional kind, the kind built from decades of careful, unglamorous choices, belongs to you, not to your children, not to anyone who appears in your life when the money is useful and disappears when it isn't. Nobody gets to ask you to purchase a place in your own family. Nobody gets to make your value conditional on what you can provide. If they do, the answer is no. The answer is a clean, clear, undramatic no, followed by a call to a professional who can help you protect what you've built. And here's the hardest thing. The people who hurt us are rarely simple villains. Chloe, who cried on the phone and said things that were genuinely true, even when they were also self-serving. Ryan, who couldn't answer clearly whether he missed me, but who wrote 4 pages by hand and put a photograph in an envelope. The grief of loving someone who has not loved you well is real, and it does not require you to minimize it, but it also does not have to be the only story you're living. You're allowed to grieve the family you didn't have and still build something real from whatever material is available. Those two things can coexist. They have to. And you are never too old to start over, not at 50, not at 60, not at 63, standing in an empty house that once held a life organized around waiting, deciding to go somewhere you drove through once 4 years ago and haven't been able to stop thinking about. The new thing you build will be imperfect. You will be lonely at first. You will be bad at the thing you're trying to learn. None of that means you're doing it wrong. It means you're doing it. The porch light I used to leave on in the old house, the one I'd been leaving on for 20 years out of a habit I couldn't break. I understand now what I was really doing. I was waiting for my children to come home, keeping the light on for people who had already decided not to come back. In Marin's Bluff, I leave the porch light on too. Old habits. But it means something different now. It's not waiting, it's just light. It's a woman who lives in this house and came home and put the light on because she lives here, and this is where she belongs, and the light is for her. I chose myself. It took 63 years in a navy dress and a folder full of documents and one word said quietly across a dinner table to people who had counted on me not being able to say it. But I said it, and the life that came after that one word is the truest one I've ever lived. If you have been waiting for permission to say no to the thing that is costing you everything, this is it. This is the permission. You don't need theirs. You only ever needed yours. My name is Margaret Ellis. I live in Marin's Bluff, 2 blocks from the water. I paint on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and I'm getting better slowly. I talk to my son on Tuesday evenings, and my daughter on alternate Sundays, and my granddaughter Sophie every other Sunday after that. And my grandson Eli and I have an ongoing conversation about naval history that I am learning more from than he is. It is not the family I imagined. It is the one that exists. And I am, at last, fully and without apology, present in it. Your independence, the financial kind, the emotional kind, the kind built from decades of careful, unglamorous choices, belongs to you. Not to your children. Not to anyone who appears in your life when the money is useful and disappears when it isn't. Nobody gets to ask you to purchase a place in your own family. Nobody gets to make your value conditional on what you can provide. If they do, the answer is no. The answer is a clean, clear, undramatic no, followed by a call to a professional who can help you protect what you've built. And here's the hardest thing. The people who hurt us are rarely simple villains. Chloe, who cried on the phone and said things that were genuinely true even when they were also self-serving. Ryan, who couldn't answer clearly whether he missed me, but who wrote 4 pages by hand and put a photograph in an envelope. The grief of loving someone who has not loved you well is real, and it does not require you to minimize it, but it also does not have to be the only story you're living. You're allowed to grieve the family you didn't have and still build something real from whatever material is available. Those two things can coexist. They have to. And you are never too old to start over. Not at 50, not at 60, not at 63. Standing in an empty house that once held a life organized around waiting, deciding to go somewhere you drove through once 4 years ago and haven't been able to stop thinking about. The new thing you build will be imperfect. You will be lonely at first. You will be bad at the thing you're trying to learn. None of that means you're doing it wrong. It means you're doing it. The porch light I used to leave on, in the old house, the one I'd been leaving on for 20 years out of a habit I couldn't break. I understand now what I was really doing. I was waiting for my children to come home, keeping the light on for people who had already decided not to come back. In Marin's Bluff, I leave the porch light on too. Old habits. But it means something different now. It's not waiting, it's just light. It's a woman who lives in this house and came home and put the light on because she lives here, and this is where she belongs, and the light is for her. I chose myself. It took 63 years and a navy dress and a folder full of documents and one word said quietly across a dinner table to people who had counted on me not being able to say it. But I said it. And the life that came after that one word is the truest one I've ever lived. If you have been waiting for permission to say no to the thing that is costing you everything, this is it. This is the permission. You don't need theirs. You only ever needed yours. My name is Margaret Ellis. I live in Marin's Bluff, 2 blocks from the water. I paint on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and I'm getting better slowly. I talk to my son on Tuesday evenings, and my daughter on alternate Sundays, and my granddaughter Sophie every other Sunday after that, and my grandson Eli and I have an ongoing conversation about naval history that I am learning more from than he is. It is not the family I imagined. It is the one that exists, and I am, at last, fully and without apology, present in it.